Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku became the balance between heroes and villains in all worlds. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world was ending in screams and the taste of ash. The sky above the ruins of Jaka City was no longer blue, but a bruised and bleeding canvas of crimson and violet, choked with soot from Endeavor's dying flames and the dust of pulverized skyscrapers. The air itself felt thin, charged with a horrifying static that made the hairs on one's arms stand to attention. It was the atmosphere of a dying god's last breath. At the epicenter of this apocalypse stood two figures, locked in a battle that had long since transcended the physical. Izuku Midoriya, the ninth holder of One for All, was a ruin in human form. His hero costume was shredded, offering glimpses of a body that was more scar tissue and raw sinew than flesh. Black Whip, no longer controlled tendrils but agonized, thorny vines, erupted from his back, lashing at the air with a mind of their own. The bones in his arms and legs, shattered and healed by the impossible strain of 120% power output, were a latticework of pain. Every heartbeat was a fresh agony, a reminder that his body was a vessel tearing itself apart to contain an ever-growing sun. Emerald lightning, wild and furious, danced across his skin, scorching the very ground he stood on. He was a martyr burning on a pyre of his own making. Opposite him was the culmination of all their fears. Tamura Shigaraki was no longer a man. He was a living cathedral of stolen flesh and hatred, a monstrous effigy animated by the will of All for One. His body was a writhing landscape of mouths and eyes, limbs fused and reformed into weapons of grotesque efficiency. The decay quirk radiated from him in waves of invisible death, turning the rubble beneath his feet into fine gray dust before it even settled. He was a force of nature, a black hole of consumption whose only purpose was to erase everything. Inside Deku, a war of ghosts raged. The vestiges of One for All, Nana Shimura, Daigoro Banjo, Yoichi Shigaraki, were a roaring chorus in his mind, their collective will a bulwark against the suffocating presence of All for One. They were the shield. He was the sword. Don't let him touch you, Ninth! Banjo's voice was a panicked shout in his consciousness. He's not just trying to take the quirk, he's trying to unmake you. His hatred is a poison, Nana Shimura added, her voice taut with a pain that spanned generations. It seeks to corrupt everything we built. Stand firm, Izuku. But All for One's psychic assault was relentless. It wasn't a shout, it was a pervasive, insidious whisper that slithered into the cracks of Deku's soul. It showed him visions of his failures, Bakugo, impaled, his teachers, overwhelmed, civilians he couldn't reach in time. It promised him an end to the pain, a quiet place where he wouldn't have to carry the weight of the world. Just let go. Give it to me. This burden was never meant for the shoulders of a child. They clashed again. It wasn't a clash of fists, but a collision of universes. Shigaraki's arm, a horrifying amalgam of muscle and bone spikes, shot forward. Deku met it with a kick that bent reality, the shockwave vaporizing what little remained of the buildings around them. The impact sent them both skidding back, leaving two deep trenches carved into the bedrock. Deku coughed, blood spattering on the gray dust. He was losing. He knew it with a terrifying certainty. One for All was the power to save, to build, to pass on. All for One was the power to take, to hoard, to dominate. In a battle of pure attrition, the void would always outlast the flame. He could feel his own energy, the very essence of the 8 souls before him, being siphoned away, pulled into the gravity well of Shigaraki's being. He could see the other battles raging on the periphery. Endeavor, a flickering candle against a hurricane, was barely holding back a legion of Heian Noma. Shoto's ice walls were sublimating into steam as fast as he could erect them. Bakugo, a furious comet of explosions, was fighting with a desperation that bordered on self-immolation, trying to carve a path back to Deku's side. They were all fighting their own wars, but this central conflict was the one that mattered. If he fell, everything fell. It's not enough, Deku thought, his vision blurring. Destroying him isn't enough. He'll just regenerate. He'll just take more. And then, through the psychic maelstrom, through the clash of quirks and wills, he saw it. It wasn't a vision or a memory projected by AFO. It was a flicker, a glitch in the monster's code. For a single, infinitesimal second, as their consciousnesses brushed against each other at the speed of light, he didn't see the smirking visage of All for One or the cracked, hate-filled face of Tamura Shigaraki. He saw a little boy with dry, cracked skin, sitting alone in a dark room, his dog turning to dust at his feet. He saw Tenko Shimura, weeping in an alleyway, ignored by heroes and civilians alike. A child lost in the woods, who was found not by a savior, but by a wolf. The core of Izuku Midoriya, the very foundation of his being, roared to life, overpowering the pain and the exhaustion. It was a single, immutable drive that had defined him since he was a quirkless, weeping child. I want to save everyone. And in that moment of terrible, divine clarity, he knew what he had to do. It was insane. It was illogical. The vestiges screamed in protest. Ninth, no! That's what he wants. You can't save a man who is already a ghost. But Deku tuned them out. His purpose crystallized. He wasn't going to destroy Shigaraki. He wasn't going to defeat All for One. He was going to reach past both of them and pull Tenko Shimura back from the brink. He gathered One for All, not into a fist of annihilation, but into an open palm of salvation. The emerald energy condensed, not with the sharp, crackling sound of a destructive force, but with a soft, resonant hum, like a sacred bell. Shigaraki, sensing the shift in power, grinned. The dozens of mouths on his body twisted into a collective sneer. Giving up? Decided to hand it over? A wise choice. He lunged, his primary hand outstretched, fingers splayed wide, ready to finally consume the quirk that had defied him for a century. His will was a singularity of pure consumption. Deku met his lunge. He didn't dodge. He didn't counter. He moved forward, his own hand, glowing with the light of 9 generations of hope, aimed not for Shigaraki's face or chest, but for the center of his being. His goal was absolute preservation. His opponent's goal was absolute consumption. The irresistible force met the immovable object, not on the physical plane, but on a conceptual one. They met within the soul of Izuku Midoriya. Time did not stop. It ceased to be relevant. There was no sound. No deafening explosion. No earth-shattering quake. There was only a silent, impossible detonation of light. A wave of pure information, of paradox made manifest, expanded from the point of contact. Emerald green, the color of life, of succession, of heroic sacrifice. Abyssal crimson, the color of stolen power, of dominance, of eternal hunger. The colors didn't mix. They didn't blend into a muddy brown. They swelled together, a silent, expanding sphere of swirling, warring concepts. The green fought to create, to connect, to save. The red fought to consume, to control, to erase. And at the nexus of this impossible war, trapped between the ultimate act of giving and the ultimate act of taking, was Izuku Midoriya. Everywhere on the battlefield, the fighting stopped. Heroes and villains alike were frozen, not by a quirk, but by a fundamental wrongness in the fabric of reality. The Nomas ceased their rampage, their heads cocked as if listening to a sound no one could hear. Bakugo, mid-explosion, hung in the air, his blast frozen into a crystal of orange light. Shoto's flames and ice held their shape, a static sculpture of opposing temperatures. The very laws of physics were holding their breath. The sphere of light pulsed once, twice, and then collapsed inward, imploding with silent, cosmic violence directly into Deku's body. For a moment, there was nothing. Only the boy, floating in the epicenter of the unnatural calm, his head bowed. Then, he lifted his head. The change was both subtle and absolute. The wild, untamed bush of his green hair was now streaked with veins of bone white, stark and unnatural, as if he had aged 1,000 years in a second. His face, once open and emotional, was now a mask of serene, terrifying calm. The scars remained, but they seemed less like wounds and more like lines on a map, telling the story of a journey that was now complete. But it was his eyes that held the true horror and wonder of his transformation. His right eye burned with the familiar, fierce emerald fire of One for All. It was the eye of a hero, filled with compassion, determination, and the light of 9 souls. It saw the world in terms of right and wrong, of people to be saved, of a future to be protected. His left eye, however, was a cold, bottomless well of crimson. It was the eye of All for One. It didn't burn with hatred. It glowed with a chilling, analytical light, the light of absolute understanding. It saw the world not as people, but as systems. It saw causality, potential, and power. It saw the levers that made the universe turn, and it knew how to pull them. The quirks that had once raged around him like a storm were now quiescent. Black whip drifted from his back like strands of silken shadow. The energy afloat held him a foot off the ground without thought. Fa Gene, danger sense, smokescreen. They were no longer separate powers he had to call upon. They were ethereal energies, extensions of his will, orbiting him like planets around a new star, obeying thoughts not yet formed. The silence was finally broken by a guttural roar. Shigaraki, drained and bewildered, his connection to all for one feeling frayed and distant, acted on pure, primal instinct. His body, a grotesque parody of a predator, lunged. His right hand, a claw of hardened bone, shot forward, the air around it beginning to shimmer as the decay quirk reignited. He would erase this abomination. Deku didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply raised his left hand, palm open. The wave of decay hit an invisible barrier a foot from his body and dissolved into nothing. Shigaraki's eyes widened in disbelief. He pushed, pouring more power into it, his hatred a focused beam of annihilation. But it was like trying to burn the ocean. The concept of decay washed over the concept of Deku and simply ceased to be. Shigaraki froze, his monstrous form trembling, not with rage, but with a new, unfamiliar emotion, fear. The voices in his head, all for one's confident smirk, were gone. He was alone in the quiet of his own mind for the first time in years, and it was terrifying. The conflict is over. The voice came from Deku, but it wasn't his voice. It was a chorus, a perfect, calm harmony of hundreds of voices speaking as one. The resolute tone of Nana Shimura, the gruffness of Daigoro Banjo, the quiet wisdom of Yoichi, Deku's own youthful tenor, and chillingly, the cold, regal baritone of All for One. They were all there, no longer at war, but synthesized into a single, resonant entity. He lowered his hand, his dichromatic gaze sweeping across the stunned assembly of fighters. He looked at Endeavor's flickering flames, at Dabi's self-immolating rage, at Bakugo's confusion, at Uraraka's tear-streaked face peeking from behind a slab of concrete. He saw them all, not as friends or foes, but as weights on a cosmic scale. He could see the threads of their lives, the potential for creation in Bakugo's explosive power, the seeds of order in Ida's discipline, the necessary chaos in Toga's twisted love, the anchor of destruction in Shigaraki's existence. The roles of hero and villain as you know them are now obsolete. The voice continued calm and declarative, speaking a truth so profound it felt like a physical blow. Such narrow definitions have led this world, and countless others, to the brink of ruin. There is no absolute good, no absolute evil. There is only the balance. He turned his gaze back to the frozen form of Shigaraki. With a flick of his wrist, the stolen quirks that made up Shigaraki's monstrous body writhed. A dozen different energies were ripped from him, not with the violence of All for One's theft, but with the surgical precision of a god rewinding time. The excess limbs and mouths receded. The stolen quirks flew from him as motes of light, scattering across the battlefield before vanishing. Shigaraki collapsed, still monstrously powerful with his original decay, but reduced, diminished. He was no longer a one-man army, but a single, potent piece on the board. The act wasn't punishment. It wasn't mercy. It was calibration. From the ranks of the heroes, two figures stumbled forward, their movements clumsy in the face of such impossible grace. Katsuki Bakugo, his gauntlets smoking, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, pointed a trembling finger. Deku! What the hell did you do? What the hell is this? His voice, for the first time in his life, was laced with genuine, uncomprehending fear. The rival he had measured himself against his entire life had just moved the finish line to the other side of infinity. Beside him, a gaunt, skeletal figure in a tattered yellow suit took a step. All Might. His true form was exposed to the world, but he didn't care. All he could see was the boy he had chosen, the boy who had inherited his will, now standing as something alien and terrifying. He saw the kindness in the right eye, and the abyss in the left. He saw the culmination of his own legacy, twisted into a shape he could never have imagined. Tears welled in his sunken eyes, born of pride, sorrow, and a dread so deep it felt like it was hollowing out his soul. He saw the end of his black and white world of good versus evil, of symbols of peace and lords of evil. He saw its replacement, and it was a terrifying, incomprehensible gray. Young Midoriya! All Might's voice was a ragged, broken whisper, a father's plea to a son who had gone somewhere he couldn't follow. What have you become? Deku turned his head slowly, his gaze, one eye of hope, one of dominion, falling upon his mentor. The chorus of voices spoke again, not with anger, not with pride, but with the simple, irrefutable finality of a universal law. Something necessary. Here are the 7,000-word chapters for the fulcrum, based on the provided outlines. The fragile, temporary peace that had descended upon the battlefield shattered not with a bang, but with the whir of helicopter blades and the clinical stamp of polished boots. The Hero Public Safety Commission arrived with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, their movements precise, their faces grimly professional. They were not here to celebrate a victory or mourn the dead. They were here to contain an anomaly. Their target stood motionless at the epicenter of the devastation, a serene statue amidst the ruins of a war he had just rendered meaningless. The heroes and remaining villains kept their distance, forming a wide, ragged circle around Izuku Midoriya. It was a quarantine born of instinctual fear. He hadn't moved since his final, chilling declaration. He simply floated, his head slightly bowed as if in contemplation, the twin suns of his eyes, one green, one red, casting a strange, bifurcated light on the dust at his feet. A man in a crisp black suit, flanked by two elite heroes in tactical gear, stepped forward. It was the president of the HPSC, a man whose face was usually a mask of calm authority. Now, it was pale, his composure strained to the breaking point. Izuku Midoriya! The president called out, his voice amplified by a small device but still sounding thin in the vast, silent arena. By the authority of the Hero Public Safety Commission, you are to stand down and come with us. You are being taken into protective custody for assessment. A ripple of protest went through the watching heroes. Custody? He just saved us! Someone shouted, though their voice lacked conviction. Deku's head lifted slowly. The harmonious chorus of his new voice filled the space without any need for amplification, calm and resonant. I will not resist. Your authority is a valid expression of this world's desire for order. It is a necessary weight on the scale. His compliance was more unnerving than any threat could have been. He descended gracefully to the ground, his feet touching the scorched earth without a sound. The HPSC operatives tensed, their hands hovering over their quirk-suppressing equipment. But he made no move. He simply waited, his posture one of patient observation, as if he were a scientist studying their reactions. Bakugo lunged forward, held back only by Kirishima's hardening arms wrapped around his chest. Don't you dare go with them, you damn nerd! What is wrong with you? Talk to us! Deku turned his dichromatic gaze to Bakugo. For a fleeting moment, the human part of the crowd expected to see a flash of annoyance, a flicker of their shared history. There was nothing, only a calm, analytical assessment. Your rage, Katsuki Bakugo, is a potent catalyst for change. A necessary chaotic force. The fulcrum stated, the words echoing his previous pronouncement. But it is a force of ignition, not of understanding. You cannot comprehend what has occurred by trying to explode it. The statement was so bizarrely accurate, so completely devoid of personal feeling, that it stopped Bakugo cold. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't praise. It was a classification, as if he were labeling an element on a periodic table. Bakugo stared, his mouth slightly agape, the usual furious retort dying in his throat. Kirishima's grip loosened, his own confusion mirroring his friend's. Without another word, Deku turned and walked toward the waiting HPSC agents. They flinched as he approached, but he passed between them as if they were nothing more than gateposts, heading for the heavily armored transport vehicle. He stepped inside, and the door hissed shut with a deafening finality. The world he had saved watched him be taken away like a prisoner, and no one knew what to do. The war was over, but the peace felt colder and more terrifying than the fight. The interrogation room was a sterile white box, deep beneath the HPSC headquarters. It was designed to be psychologically disarming, a blank space where lies had nowhere to hide. Izuku Midoriya sat on a simple metal chair, his hands resting on the table before him. He wore a plain gray jumpsuit, his altered hair a stark monochrome splash against the muted fabric. The quirk-suppressing cuffs they had clamped on his wrists were dark and inert. They were utterly useless, he knew, like trying to dam a tsunami with a garden fence, but he allowed the gesture. It was part of their process, their ritual of order. Across from him sat Detective Naomasa Tsukachi, his face etched with exhaustion and a deep, profound worry. His lie detector quirk was the most reliable tool in law enforcement, a simple binary of truth and falsehood. He feared it would be of little use today. Midoriya, Tsukachi began, his voice gentle. Can you tell me what happened on the battlefield? After you made contact with Shigaraki, the entity that was once Deku looked at him, and for a moment, Tsukachi felt the full weight of his new perception. He felt like a collection of data points being instantly processed, a man driven by a strict moral code, a deep loyalty to All Might, a fear for the future, a desire for simple, objective truth. The concepts of absolute preservation and absolute consumption met within a single vessel. The fulcrum's chorus voice replied. One for all sought to save. All for one sought to take. Unable to overwrite one another, they achieved a paradoxical synthesis. The vessel, Izuku Midoriya, became the point of balance between them. He became the fulcrum. Tsukachi's quirk screamed at him. True. 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 The words were fact, as fundamental as gravity. But they made no sense. So, you are not Izuku Midoriya? Tsukachi pressed, his pen hovering over his notepad. I am. And I am not, the fulcrum said. Izuku Midoriya is the foundation. He is the original moral framework upon which this consciousness is built. His drive to save is the anchor that prevents the all-for-one aspect from seeking dominion. But the boy you knew, his singular perspective, his emotional responses, they are now components of a much larger whole. I am the synthesis. I am the library. He is the cornerstone. True. Tsukachi felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. This was already beyond him. You said the roles of hero and villain are obsolete, he said, latching onto something more concrete. What did you mean by that? They are limited constructs. The fulcrum explained, its tone patient, like a professor lecturing a student. This world, and countless others, defines existence as a struggle between two opposing moral absolutes. Good must eradicate evil. Order must suppress chaos. This binary is a catalyst for perpetual, escalating conflict. The hero's desire for absolute order, if left unchecked, would inevitably become a form of tyranny. A gilded cage. Conversely, the villain's desire for absolute freedom would lead to a world of pure chaos, where nothing can be built, and all is consumed by selfish impulse. Neither state is sustainable, neither allows for growth. Tsukachi's mind reeled. He thought of the Commission's more morally gray decisions, the secrets they kept, the lines they blurred for the sake of peace. You see it now. The fulcrum's voice was softer, laced with a hint of something that might have been pity. You feel the truth of it. I do not just see it. I perceive it as a fundamental mechanic of reality. I looked upon the hero Dabi, and I saw a force of destructive truth. His rage, born of neglect and abuse at the hands of the number one hero, was a necessary balancing agent to the public's blind worship of the hero system. His existence, however painful, forced a necessary reckoning. He was a weight that prevented the hero's side of the scale from tipping into unchecked hubris. True. The words slammed into Tsukachi's mind with the force of a physical blow. He had spent his career seeing Dabi as a mass murderer, a monster, but the entity before him saw him as a vital part of an equation. And the heroes? Tsukachi asked, his voice barely a whisper. I see the seeds of tyranny in their unwavering belief in their own righteousness. The fulcrum stated, its gaze piercing. The desire to control, to eliminate all threats, to create a world without risk, that is a path that ends in the suppression of free will. A world perfectly safe is a world perfectly stagnant. The potential for villainy must exist for the concept of heroism to have meaning. Shadow is what gives light its shape. True. 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 Each statement was a verifiable fact from this being's perspective. Tsukachi put his pen down. He was a detective. He dealt in evidence and motive. The being in front of him dealt in cosmic mechanics. This was not an interrogation. This was a theological dissertation. "What do you want?" Tsukachi finally asked, the most important question. The fulcrum's dual-colored eyes seemed to look through him, through the walls of the room, out into the world beyond. "Izuku Midoriya wanted to be the world's greatest hero," the chorus voice said, a hint of the boy's original earnestness coloring the tone. "The fulcrum does not want. The fulcrum is. Its purpose is to maintain the equilibrium of existence. To ensure that neither creation nor destruction, order nor chaos, can achieve absolute victory and render the universe static. My purpose is to ensure the struggle continues, for the struggle is life." Before Tsukachi could process the terrifying implications of that statement, the door to the observation room opened. A grim-faced guard entered. "Sir? His friends are here. They're refusing to leave." The visitation room was as stark as the interrogation cell, but with a thick pane of reinforced glass separating the two sides. On one side stood Achiko Uraraka, Tenya Ida, and Shoto Todoroki. They had been cleaned up by Recovery Girl, but the emotional wounds of the war were still fresh. On the other side, Deku was led in, taking a seat with the same unnerving placidity. Uraraka pressed her hands against the cold glass, her knuckles white. Her face was a mess of tear tracks, hope, and terror. "Deku-kun? It's us. Are you okay? What did they do to you?" The fulcrum's head tilted. It perceived her emotional state as a complex web of gravitational forces, concern for his well-being, romantic affection, fear of the unknown, a desperate pull towards the past, towards the friend she knew. "I am not injured, Achiko Uraraka," it replied, the chorus voice softening slightly, attempting to mimic the cadence of the boy she remembered. The attempt only made it more alien. "Your concern is a powerful force of cohesion. It is a manifestation of the connective drive of one for all. But it is directed at a memory. The Deku-kun you are reaching for is now a component, not the whole." Uraraka flinched as if slapped. The clinical analysis of her feelings was 1,000 times more painful than simple rejection. It was like he was describing her love as a fascinating but irrelevant scientific phenomenon. Ida stepped forward, his movements rigid with emotion. "Midoriya, my friend! This is illogical. You must explain yourself in a manner we can comprehend. As your class representative, I implore you to follow the proper procedures so we can help you." "Tenya Ida," the fulcrum said, its gaze shifting. "Your life is governed by rules and procedures. A framework of order. It is a noble and necessary pursuit, but you are attempting to apply the rules of a single household to the physics of a galaxy. The procedures you know are not equipped to handle a conceptual singularity. My existence is, by its very nature, outside your established framework." Ida stood speechless, his entire worldview dismissed as quaint but inadequate. Shoto, ever the quiet observer, had been studying Deku's eyes. He, more than anyone, understood living with two opposing forces within oneself. "Midoriya," he said, his voice low and even, "is this like my fire and ice? Are you fighting with yourself?" The fulcrum seemed to consider this for a long moment. It was the first question that treated his state as a functional reality rather than a problem to be solved. "A perceptive analogy, Shoto Todoroki," it responded. "You struggle to balance the legacy of two different origins within yourself. A worthy, human-scale struggle. What has happened to me is that on a cosmic scale. But there is no longer a fight. My fire and my ice have not found peace. They have fused into something new. A state of being that is either, and both. The struggle is over. Now I simply am." The finality in its tone was crushing. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't a villain's influence to be purged. This was a permanent state of being. The door behind them crashed open and Bakugo stormed in, his face a thundercloud of fury. "Out of my way, extras!" he snarled, shoving past them to slam his hands against the glass. The guards behind him tensed but did not intervene. "Deku!" he roared, his voice cracking. "Stop talking to them like they're bugs under a microscope. Stop talking to me like that. Whatever that damn villain did to you, we'll fix it. I'll beat it out of you myself if I have to. So drop the god-complex crap and start talking like the damn nerd you are." It was a desperate, angry, terrified plea. A plea for a return to normalcy, to the rivalry that had defined both their lives. The Fulcrum's gaze met his. The red and green eyes showed no anger, no fear, no reaction at all to the outburst. You believe this is a corruption? The chorus voice stated simply. A flaw to be corrected. You are trying to force reality back into a shape you understand. Your explosive nature, the very essence of your quirk, is a microcosm of the Big Bang, a violent, chaotic event that creates new possibilities. It is valuable. It is necessary. But it cannot unmake a star. I am not broken, Katsuki. I am complete. Bakugo stared, his rage deflating into a hollow confusion. For the second time, Deku had validated his entire being while simultaneously trivializing him. He wasn't a rival. He was a cosmic tool, an interesting gear in a machine he couldn't even see. The frustration was so immense, so profound, he couldn't even form a word. He just stood there, trembling, defeated not by force, but by a scope of existence he could not match. The Fulcrum watched them, its new senses perceiving something far beyond their emotional turmoil. A subtle, discordant hum in the fabric of their reality. A strain, and it understood. It was him. He was the problem. His very presence, a perfect synthesis of the universe's ultimate hero and villain archetypes, was a mass so great it was warping the reality of his home world. He was a star that had grown too large, its gravity pulling the surrounding planets out of their comfortable orbits. His existence here was creating an imbalance, a conceptual vacuum that the universe itself was desperately trying to fill. Minor villains would gain disproportionate power. Heroic acts would have unforeseen, disastrous consequences. The scales, which he was meant to embody, were being broken by his sheer proximity. He could not stay. His purpose was not here, in the world he had fought to save. It was out there, in the countless other worlds that teetered on the brink. A profound, aching sadness echoed within the Fulcrum's vast consciousness, the last, fading whisper of the boy named Izuku Midoriya. The boy who had wanted nothing more than to stay here, with these people. The boy who was now going to be eternally exiled by his own nature. He stood up. The visit is over. He was released from custody that evening. There was no ceremony. The HPSC, acting on a recommendation from a shell-shocked Scotchy, understood that they could not hold him. They could not control him. They could only get out of his way. He didn't go to the UA dorms. He went to a small, unassuming apartment in Mizurufu. Inko Midoriya opened the door, and her world stopped. She saw her son, but not her son. She saw his familiar green hair, now streaked with the white of age and sorrow. She saw his eyes, one the loving eye of her baby boy, the other the eye of a stranger from a different, colder world. Izuku? She whispered, tears instantly welling. Oh, my baby, what happened to you? She reached for him, and for the first time, the Fulcrum's serene composure fractured. A flicker of raw, human pain crossed its features. The Izuku component surged forward, a wave of agony and love. He caught his mother in a hug, burying his face in her shoulder. Mom! He choked out, and for a moment, it was just his voice. Young, broken, and full of sorrow. The scent of her perfume, the familiar feel of her embrace, it was an anchor to a world he was already leaving. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice beginning to fracture back into the chorus. I'm so sorry. I saved them. I saved everyone. But I couldn't save me. Inko held him, sobbing, feeling the strange, immense power radiating from him, the terrifying calm that lay just beneath his momentary grief. She didn't understand what he had become, but she understood loss. She was a mother, and she knew she was holding her son for the last time. An hour later, he stood on a quiet hill overlooking the city. The lights twinkled below, a sea of peaceful, ordinary lives he had protected. Another figure was waiting for him, a skeletal silhouette against the rising moon. All might, the Fulcrum said. Toshinori Yagi turned, his face a road map of grief. Young Midoriya. Or whatever I should call you now, you can call me Izuku. The Fulcrum said, its voice a soft harmony. The part of me that is your successor appreciates the courtesy. They stood in silence for a long time, master and student, symbol and successor, past and future. I don't understand this. All Might finally admitted, his voice raw. I gave you my power to be a symbol of peace. To save people with a smile. To be a pillar of hope. What you've become, it's so much more, and so much less. You taught me to be a hero, Tashinori. And that lesson is the only thing that gives my existence meaning. The fulcrum replied, turning to face him fully. The green eye was filled with a deep, reverent gratitude. Without your guidance, without the core belief that saving people is the ultimate good, the power of all for one would have consumed me. I would have become a tyrant god. The foundation of Izuku Midoriya, the foundation you helped build, is the only thing that allows me to be the fulcrum and not the executioner. A tear traced a path through the grime on All Might's cheek. So this is it? You're leaving? I must. My presence here unbalances this reality. My work is not in one world, but in all of them. I am no longer a hero of Japan. I am a function of the multiverse. He held out a hand. In his palm, a single, flickering ember of green light pulsed. It was a tiny, vestigial fragment of One for All. The quirk is gone, the fulcrum explained. It has become part of me. But this is its memory. The echo of your will, and of all who came before. Keep it, a reminder that your legacy did not end in failure. It evolved. All Might stared at the light, his heart aching. He had passed the torch, and his successor had used it to become a star, so bright he had to leave the sky for fear of burning the world he loved. I'm proud of you, my boy. All Might whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. I'm so proud of you, Izuku. The fulcrum gave a small, sad, human smile. It was the last gift the boy inside could offer. Goodbye, All Might. He turned away, facing the empty air. He raised a hand, and the fabric of reality tore open before him. It was not a neat circle like Kurojire's portals. It was a violent, beautiful wound in space-time, a swirling vortex of emerald creation and crimson consumption. It was a doorway made of his own essence. Without a backward glance, he stepped through the rift. The portal snapped shut, leaving behind only the scent of ozone and the silent, weeping figure of a retired hero, alone on a hill, clutching the last fading ember of a dream. Izuku Midoriya was gone. The transition was not a journey. It was a cessation and a beginning. One moment, Izuku was immersed in the familiar, vibrant hum of his home reality. The next, he was standing in a world defined by silence and the color gray. He stood in the middle of what had once been a bustling city square. Now, it was a graveyard of architecture. The skeletons of skyscrapers clawed at a sky the color of a dead television screen, perpetually overcast with a thick, chemical smog. The air was cold, thin, and tasted of ash and old sorrows. There was no birdsong, no distant traffic, no laughter. Only the mournful whistle of wind moving through the canyons of dead buildings and the faint, almost subliminal hum of oppressive power. The fulcrum senses, attuned to the cosmic balance, recoiled. This world was sick. The scales were not just tipped, they were broken, pinned to the ground under an immense, suffocating weight. The side of order, tyranny, and consumption, the side analogous to all for one, was absolute. The corresponding side of chaos, freedom, and creation was a barely flickering ember, moments from being extinguished forever. This reality was moments away from total stagnation. A death of the soul. He had arrived in a world where all for one had won. Decades ago, he began to walk, his footsteps silent on the carpet of gray dust that covered everything. He was a ghost in this purgatory, a splash of impossible color, the green in his hair, the vibrant red and green of his eyes, in a monochrome landscape. He didn't need to search for long. The nature of this world revealed itself in stark, brutal tableaus. Squads of hulking, low-grade Nomu patrolled the streets, their exposed brains pulsing with dim light, their movements jerky and unnatural. They weren't soldiers. They were biological surveillance cameras, extensions of a single, central will. Civilians, thin and gaunt, shuffled along designated pathways, their faces blank, their eyes devoid of hope. They wore simple, uniform clothing, and any deviation, a brightly colored scarf, a hurried step, earned them a chilling, silent stare from the patrolling Nomu. This was not the chaotic dystopia of a villain's victory he might have imagined. It was a world of perfect, crushing order. The peace of the tomb. His danger sense, now a far more sophisticated tool, wasn't screaming. It was emitting a low, constant thrum, like the background radiation of a dying star. The danger here wasn't acute, it was existential. He felt a flicker of defiance, a spark of chaos in the oppressive order. A pulse of energy that was unsanctioned, rebellious. He moved towards it, melting into the shadows of a ruined archway. In a narrow, rubble-choked alley, a skirmish was underway. On one side were two Nomu, their muscular bodies absorbing kinetic impacts with grim efficiency. On the other were three figures, ragged and desperate. They were the remnants of this world's heroes. Their costumes were tattered patches on worn leather, their faces smudged with grime and fury. Their leader was a man who looked hauntingly familiar. He was older, his face leaner and harder, a web of scars around one eye. The vibrant red wings that should have adorned his back were gone, replaced by a complex mechanical rig from which a few dozen sharp, metallic feathers could be deployed. It was this world's hawks, though his eyes held none of the easygoing charm of the man Deku knew. This was a predator, honed by decades of being the prey. Let's call him Goshawk. Pin them! Goshawk barked, his voice a low rasp. Jiro, hit them with a high-frequency pulse. Now! A young woman with familiar earphone jacks jammed them into a makeshift amplifier on her back. A piercing, disorienting wave of sound blasted the Nomu, causing them to stumble, their brains visibly spasming. They're disoriented! Go for the brain casing! A third hero, a large man with rock-like skin, bellowed. But as they moved to attack, a side street vomited forth a new group of figures. Not Nomu, but human collaborators, villainous warlords who had been granted petty fiefdoms in exchange for loyalty to the true ruler. They opened fire with energy weapons, pinning the rebels down. The rebels were trapped. Goshawk's metallic feathers flew, intercepting a few blasts, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Then Goshawk did something that made the fulcrum pause in its observation. His eyes flicked upwards, towards the crumbling facade of a residential block where a few families were huddled, watching the firefight in terror. He saw the warlord's position, and he saw the unstable support pillar of the building above them. He made a calculation. The fulcrum could almost see the cold, brutal arithmetic in his mind. Sacrifice of 3 families. Potential survival of my unit. Net gain for the rebellion. Jiro! Goshawk commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. Target the pillar. B7. The woman's eyes widened in horror. Sir? There are people up there. Civilians! They are already dead living in this world. Goshawk snapped, his gaze like flint. Their sacrifice will give us the opening we need. That is an order. Jiro hesitated, her face a mask of anguish. But decades of brutal warfare had eroded her moral compass. With tears streaming down her face, she recalibrated her amplifier. Before she could fire, a shadow moved. The fulcrum appeared between the rebels and their targets. He didn't run, he simply was there. His sudden appearance was so jarring, so out of context, that all fighting ceased for the second time in his brief existence. He looked at the rebels, his dichromatic eyes taking in their desperation, their compromised ideals. Then he looked at Goshawk. You seek to defeat a tyrant by becoming one. The fulcrum's chorus voice stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation. You believe the ends justify the means. It is a logical, but flawed progression. Goshawk stared, his hand tightening on the controls for his feathers. Who the hell are you? The fulcrum did not answer. Instead, he turned to face the warlords and the Nomu. He raised a hand, and the ground beneath their feet turned to thick, grasping mud, an effortless application of a quirk he never personally trained with but now understood implicitly. They were trapped. He ignored their panicked shouts and blaster fire, which dissolved harmlessly before reaching him. His gaze moved past them, towards the gleaming, obsidian spire that pierced the smog-filled sky at the city's heart. It was the only pristine structure in the entire metropolis, a monument to absolute power. That was where the true imbalance lay. I will show you a different path, he said to the stunned rebels, before vanishing in a silent flicker of movement, leaving them standing in a suddenly quiet alley. Their moral crisis lay bare. The throne room of the symbol of tyranny was not a place of Gothic horror, but one of sterile, decadent boredom. The floor was polished black marble, reflecting the cold, artificial light from the ceiling. The walls were lined with thousands of glass tubes, each containing a glowing, captive quirk, a library of stolen lives. At the center of it all, on a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian, sat the all-for-one of this reality. He looked different from the ruined creature Deku had fought. Having won a century ago, he had had ample time to perfect his vessel. He appeared as a man in his prime, handsome in a severe, aristocratic way, dressed in an immaculate black suit. There was no life support mask, no scar tissue. The only hint of his true nature was the unnatural stillness about him, the deep, ancient weariness in his eyes. He was an emperor presiding over a silent, dead empire. He had been observing a dozen floating holographic screens showing reports from his domain. Production quotas met, insurrections quashed, populations pacified. It was all so predictable. So dull. Then, a new screen flickered to life, showing the alleyway skirmish. It showed the impossible appearance of the boy with the mismatched eyes. All for one leaned forward, a flicker of genuine interest animating his features for the first time in decades. Well now, he murmured to himself. Something new. He didn't have to wait long. The air in front of his throne shimmered, and the fulcrum coalesced into existence, bringing with him the scent of a different, more vibrant world. I was wondering when you would arrive, All for One said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. A dimensional traveler? A new variable and a dreadfully static equation. I must thank you. I haven't felt this intrigue since I finally crushed the last vestiges of this world's heroes. The fulcrum looked at the man on the throne, the architect of this world's slow death. It saw the infinite greed, the bottomless ego, but beneath it all, it saw the rod of ultimate victory. You have achieved everything you ever desired. The fulcrum's chorus voice began, striding slowly into the center of the room. Absolute power. Absolute control. An entire world kneels before your will. You have won the game so completely that there is no one left to play with. All for One's smile faltered slightly. The boy's words cut deeper than any physical attack could. I have created peace. The villain countered, his voice smooth as silk. An end to the meaningless conflict that plagued this planet. I am the ultimate order. You have created a museum. The fulcrum retorted, gesturing to the silent city visible through a vast armored window. A collection of curiosities that no longer grow or change. There is no art here, no innovation that you do not personally sanction. No ambition. No love that is not a pale imitation of what it could be. You are the curator of a graveyard. He raised a hand, and the air between them shimmered. A vision appeared, a projection from the fulcrum's own consciousness. It showed this world, 1,000 years from now. The cities were crumbling, not from war, but from neglect. The human population had dwindled, their wills so eroded they had forgotten how to procreate with any passion. The gnomes stood like statues, their tasks completed, awaiting orders that no longer came. And on his throne, All for One was a withered husk, the quirks within him turning stagnant and useless, his mind eroded by eons of absolute, unadulterated boredom. He wasn't a king, he was a prisoner in a cell of his own design, forgotten by a universe that had moved on. You seek to be the ultimate force of history. The fulcrum's voice echoed in the throne room. But a story with no conflict is not a story. It is a single, fading word. You have not become a god, you have become irrelevant. All for One shot to his feet, his handsome facade cracking to reveal the ancient, furious monster beneath. You dare? He roared, and a dozen quirks activated at once, jets of fire, blades of compressed air, tendrils of dark energy, all screaming towards the boy. The fulcrum stood impassive. The attacks washed over him, parting like water around a stone. He didn't nullify them. He simply existed on a plane where they were meaningless. Your victory is your prison, the fulcrum said, its voice filled with a chilling, cosmic finality. Allow me to give you a gift. The gift of a true enemy. In the rebel base, a converted subway station deep underground, Goshawk and his small team were in a state of shock. He just appeared, Jiro stammered, wrapping a bandage around her arm. And he talked about what I was about to do. Goshawk was silent, staring at the schematics of the city on a flickering monitor. The stranger's words echoed in his head. You seek to defeat a tyrant by becoming one. He had justified his brutal tactics for years. It was for the greater good. It was the only way. But seeing his own cold logic reflected in the eyes of that being had shaken him to his core. A shimmer of green and red light filled their command center, and the fulcrum was there. The rebels leaped to their feet, grabbing their weapons. "We mean you no harm," Goshawk said, holding up a hand to his team. He looked at the strange boy. "What are you?" "I am the balance," it said simply. "And you are a vital part of it. Your rebellion, your desire for freedom, is the chaotic spark this world needs to avoid heat death. But you have been fighting for so long, you have forgotten what you are fighting for. You have begun to mirror the man on the throne," he showed them. He didn't need a grand projection this time. He simply touched Goshawk's forehead. The vision was brutally efficient. Goshawk saw his own victory. He saw himself standing over the corpse of All for One. He saw the joy, the relief. Then he saw the years that followed. To prevent another AFO from rising, he established a provisional government. For public safety, certain dangerous quirks were registered, then suppressed. A strict curfew was enacted. His elite soldiers, the very rebels who fought for freedom, became the new enforcers of order. He saw himself, an old man, looking at a pacified city, a safe city, a city where children could play without fear, and a city where no one was truly free. He had not broken the cage. He had merely replaced the bars and painted them a different color. Goshawk stumbled back, ripping his head away from the fulcrum's touch, his face ashen. He saw the truth. He saw the tyrant he was destined to become. What is the point then?" he whispered, his voice cracking with despair. "If victory just creates a new prison, the point is not victory," the fulcrum said, its voice softening. "The point is the struggle. The goal is not to create a perfect world. The goal is to create a world where people have the chance to strive for one. That requires both order and chaos. Both heroes and villains." And then it began. All across the dead city, something was happening. In a dusty apartment, a man who had been a menial laborer his whole life suddenly felt a crackle of electricity dance across his knuckles. A quirk his great-grandfather had possessed before it was stolen. In a crowded factory, a woman stumbled as her body became light as air, a float quirk lost 2 generations ago returning to her bloodline. In the gutters, in the slums, in the forgotten corners of the empire, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of stolen quirks were returning to their rightful lineages. The fulcrum stood in the rebel base, its eyes closed, its left hand outstretched. It was reaching across the city, into the very throne room of All for One, and not stealing, but returning. It was a surgical redistribution of power, an unraveling of a century of theft. It was picking apart the tyrant's power base, quirk by quirk. It didn't take them all. It left All for One with his immense personal power, his original quirk, and a handful of his favorites. It didn't kill him. It didn't defeat him. It just made him vulnerable. It was sowing the seeds of chaos. It was giving the people back their power, their potential, their ability to fight. In his throne room, All for One roared in fury and agony as he felt his vast collection, his life's work, being systematically dismantled. He was being weakened, his empire of control crumbling around him. But beneath the fury, a new feeling sparked. The boredom was gone. The stagnation was gone. He had enemies again. He had a struggle. He was, horrifyingly, starting to feel alive. The fulcrum lowered its hand. The process was complete. "The board has been reset," it announced to the stunned rebels. "The people have been given back their weapons. Your rebellion is no longer a desperate ember. It is one of many fires that will soon burn across this world. All for One is crippled, but he is not gone. The future is no longer a certainty. It is now a choice." It looked directly at Goshawk. "You have been given a new chance. Do not build your new world on the bones of the old one. Remember what it is to be a hero, not just a soldier." Goshawk looked at his hands, then at the map, which was now lighting up with hundreds of reports of spontaneous quirk manifestations and localized uprisings. He looked at the fulcrum, a being that had dismantled a century-old empire in a matter of minutes without throwing a single punch. It hadn't given them peace. It had given them a war. A real one. A war they now had a chance to win, and a reason to win it the right way.
Thank you,
Goshawk said, the words feeling small and insignificant. The fulcrum gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It had learned its first crucial lesson as a multiversal entity. Balance was not a state of tranquil peace. Peace was a form of stasis. True balance was a dynamic, chaotic, beautiful, and terrible equilibrium. It was the perpetual motion machine of existence, fueled by the endless struggle between opposing forces. Its job wasn't to stop the machine. Its job was to keep it running. A wound of green and red light tore open in the air behind it.
The choice is now yours,
it said, and stepped through the portal, leaving behind a world plunged into chaos. But a world that was, for the first time in 100 years, truly alive with potential. The transition from the world of ash was a physical shock. Izuku stepped from a reality of grit, decay, and the defiant screams of a nascent rebellion into a world of absolute, blinding perfection. He stood in a plaza paved with luminous, self-cleaning tiles that reflected a sky of flawless, cloudless blue. The air was cool and carried the faint, pleasant scent of ozone and blooming cherry blossoms, a fragrance so perfectly engineered it felt synthetic. Gleaming white towers, sculpted from smart materials and curved like ivory tusks, pierced the sky, their surfaces devoid of any dirt or imperfection. Holographic carps swam through the air between buildings, their scales shimmering with advertisements for mandatory wellness checks and community harmony initiatives. There were people here, hundreds of them, crossing the plaza. They were all dressed in tasteful, minimalist clothing in shades of white, cream, and soft pastels. Their faces were serene, their smiles gentle and placid. They moved with a quiet, unhurried grace, their paths never colliding, their voices never rising above a polite murmur. It was the seamless, frictionless choreography of a perfectly functioning machine. There was no crime. There was no litter. There was no poverty. There was no pain. The fulcrum's senses, which had recoiled from the broken scale of the last world, now felt an equally nauseating imbalance. It was the sensation of being held at the bottom of a deep, crystal-clear ocean. A crushing pressure, silent and absolute. The scale of chaos, freedom, and creation was so light it was barely registering. The scale of order, safety, and stagnation was a weight of continental proportions. This was a world that had died not from a wound, but from suffocation. With a thought, the fulcrum opened its mind to the world's information network. Data flowed into its consciousness, a silent torrent of history. The divergence point was clear. All Might had never been injured by All for One. He had never passed on his quirk. For 50 years, he had reigned as the undisputed, undiminished symbol of peace. His power was so absolute that major villains became an extinct species. Crime rates plummeted to near zero. Guided by his unwavering moral compass and partnered with a hyper-efficient hero public safety commission, society had been meticulously reshaped. The crowning achievement was the Quirk Harmony and Social Wellness Act, passed 3 decades ago. It was the foundational text of this perfect world. Quirks were catalogued at birth. They were classified not as good or villainous, but as harmonious or disruptive. Harmonious quirks, minor enhancements, passive abilities, gentle creation quirks, were encouraged and cultivated for the betterment of society. Disruptive quirks were another matter entirely. Anything with overt destructive potential, anything that could alter minds, warp reality, or even just create a mess, these were deemed social illnesses. There were no quirk-suppressing cuffs here. Their methods were far more insidious. Children identified with disruptive quirks were entered into mandatory, lifelong wellness programs, through a combination of biochemical inhibitors, gentle psychological reconditioning, and mimetic therapy. They were taught to fear their own abilities. Their quirks were not a gift, but a dangerous cancer to be managed, a shameful secret to be suppressed until it withered from disuse. They were taught that their desire to use their power was a symptom of social deviancy. They were taught to crave the placid normalcy of the whole. The fulcrum disconnected from the network, the sheer, benevolent horror of it all settling in its dual consciousness. This world hadn't been conquered by a villain. It had been lovingly, carefully, and systematically lobotomized by its greatest hero. As it stood there, a silent observer, a flicker of something unsanctioned brushed against its senses. It was a tiny, frantic spark of illicit energy. A whisper of chaos in the crushing silence of order. It was coming from below, from the city's clean, silent underbelly. The fulcrum didn't move. It simply allowed its physical form to de-res and re-res, phasing through the pristine tiles of the plaza, down through layers of maintenance tunnels and automated transit lines, until it materialized in a place that shouldn't exist in this perfect world. It was a decommissioned water reclamation facility. The air was damp and smelled of rust and ozone, a stark contrast to the perfumed air above. Wires and makeshift data jammers snaked along the walls, creating a Faraday cage against the city's ubiquitous surveillance. In the center of the large, circular room, a group of 5 people were huddled around a holographic projector, their faces tense and alive with emotions the fulcrum had not yet seen on the surface: frustration, anger, and a desperate, burning passion. At their head was a young woman with a familiar brown bob and bright, determined eyes. But this was not the gentle, bubbly Achiko Uraraka he knew. This Achiko was sharp, wiry, and carried an aura of defiant paranoia. Her hero costume was a patchwork of scavenged tech and dark, practical fabrics. She was not a hero in training. She was a fugitive, a terrorist. "The patrol patterns are tightening," she said, her voice a fierce whisper, pointing at a map on the projector. "They're adapting. Last night's vortex in the financial district must have really spooked them." A young man with glasses, a nervous but brilliant version of Ada, adjusted the projector. "The energy signature from your quirk is the problem, Achiko. It's a Class 7 disruptive signature. Even with our baffles, it leaves a residual gravity well echo for at least 12 minutes. It's too risky." "Risky is the point, Tenya," she shot back, her hands clenching into fists. "We have to show them. We have to remind them that there's more to life than being safe and quiet, that there's such a thing as wonder." This was her crime. Her terrorism. Achiko Uraraka, designated at birth with a high-level disruptive quirk, zero gravity, had escaped her wellness program. With her small cell of fellow disruptives, she performed acts of radical, beautiful, and utterly pointless art. She would sneak into public spaces in the dead of night, and use her quirk to create fleeting, impossible spectacles. She would make the water from a fountain rise up and dance in a zero-gravity ballet. She would touch a pile of autumn leaves and make them swirl into a silent, living vortex. Her acts caused no damage. They harmed no one. They were simply, beautifully chaotic. They were moments of impossible wonder injected into a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. And to the HPSC, that made her the most dangerous person alive. The fulcrum took a step out of the shadows. Instantly, the 5 rebels spun around, weapons raised. A young man with spiky blonde hair, a subdued, anxious Bakugo, let off a tiny, suppressed pop from his palm. A quirk he'd been taught his whole life was a destructive sickness. Achiko stared at the newcomer, her stance low and ready. She saw the strange, mismatched hair, the ethereal quirks drifting like smoke, and the impossible, dual-colored eyes. He was an unknown, an anomaly, and in this world, the unknown was the enemy. "HPSC Special Division?" she snarled. "Or are you one of All Might's personal enforcers?" The fulcrum's chorus voice was soft, careful not to startle them further. "I am either." It looked at the defiant girl before it, and the Izuku component within its consciousness felt a profound ache. This was the girl whose fierce determination had inspired him, now forged into a weapon by a world that feared her. "Your creations," the fulcrum continued, its gaze sweeping over their tense faces. "The vortex of leaves. The dancing water. They are acts of profound creation. You introduce beauty that serves no function but to exist. In a world that has outlawed all forms of chaos, a pointless act of beauty is the highest form of rebellion." The group stared, stunned into silence. Their entire lives, they had been told their impulses were a sickness. This stranger, this impossible being, had just looked into the core of their rebellion and defined it with a poet's precision. Achiko slowly lowered her stance, her suspicion warring with a desperate hope. What are you?" "I am a traveler," it said simply. "I have come from a world much like your own, but one where the struggle was allowed to continue. A world where a boy with a useless quirk and a girl who wanted to help her parents could become heroes." The words hit her like a physical blow. The simple, honest dream of her counterpart in another reality was a fantasy more wild than any fiction she could imagine.
"Why are you here?"
she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "This world is dying," the fulcrum stated. "It is caught in a state of perfect, crystalline stasis. It needs to be reminded how to breathe. Your art is a gasp for air. I am here to help you turn it into a breath." The Aegis Tower was the heart of the world. It was a structure of pure white, reaching so high into the sky that it seemed to pin the blue expanse in place. The office at its peak was a monument to benevolent sterility. White walls, white furniture, and a floor-to-ceiling panoramic window that looked out over the perfect, gleaming city. It was less an office and more a modern deity's watchtower, and on a simple white chair, looking out over his creation, sat the deity himself, All Might. He was not the skeletal, haunted man the fulcrum remembered. He was in his eternal prime, a mountain of muscle and radiant charisma. His golden hair swept back perfectly, and his smile, the legendary smile that had saved millions, was bright, confident, and utterly untroubled. He turned as the fulcrum materialized in the center of his office, his blue eyes showing not surprise, but a sort of weary recognition.
"I knew this day would come eventually,"
All Might said, his voice the familiar, booming baritone of a global icon.
"An extra-dimensional threat. I have run simulations for this contingency for decades. I am not a threat,"
the fulcrum replied, its chorus voice echoing in the pristine silence.
"No."
All Might stood up, and the sheer force of his presence was a physical pressure. He was the absolute center of this world's gravity.
"You are an unknown variable. A chaotic element.
In this world, that is the definition of a threat. I have worked for 50 years to eliminate all such variables. To create a world free of chaos, free of villains, free of pain." He gestured to the city sprawling below them, a perfect, gleaming circuit board of human lives.
"Look at it. No more children crying over dead parents. No more cities turned to rubble. No more fear.
I have saved them all permanently. Is this not the dream of every hero? Is this not the ultimate victory?" The fulcrum walked towards the window, standing beside the giant, its own slender frame a strange contrast. It looked down at the silent, orderly world.
"You have confused the hospital with the home," the fulcrum said. "You have treated the entire human race for a disease called struggle, and your cure has been to place them all in a medically induced coma.
They do not feel pain, it is true. But they do not feel joy, either. They feel nothing." All Might's smile tightened at the edges.
"They feel contentment. They are safe. That is enough, is it?"
the fulcrum challenged, turning to face him. The green eye was filled with a sorrowful understanding, the red eye was cold with analytical judgment.
"Art, innovation, love, courage, these things are not born from contentment. They are forged in the fires of struggle. Art is born from a desperate need to express a feeling.
Innovation is born from a problem that needs solving. True, passionate love is a chaotic, unpredictable force that is the antithesis of your orderly world. And courage."
It paused, its voice dropping slightly.
"Courage cannot exist in a world without fear." The fulcrum raised its hand, a vision appearing in the air between them. It showed a young Izuku Midoriya, quirkless, terrified, scrambling up a sludge villain's body to try and save a screaming Katsuki Bakugo. The act was foolish, suicidal, and utterly illogical.
"In my world,"
the fulcrum said, its voice resonating with the memory of that moment,
"a quirkless, useless boy, driven by an irrational heroic impulse, performed an act of magnificent, pointless courage.
That single, chaotic act was the catalyst that led to the defeat of All for One. It was the birth of a hero." The vision shifted. It showed a similar boy in this world, displaying early signs of heroic complex, a recognized symptom of a disruptive personality. The boy was taken to a gentle, smiling therapist. He was given medication. He was shown mimetic programs that taught him that his impulse to run into danger was a sickness. The final image was of the same boy, now a teenager, walking placidly through a park, his eyes as empty as everyone else's.
"In your world," the fulcrum stated, "you would have cured him. You would have saved him from his own potential greatness. You have not created a world of heroes.
You have created a world where heroism is impossible." All Might's massive fists clenched at his sides, his smile finally vanishing.
You speak of chaos and struggle as if they are virtues. I have seen what they do. I have held dying friends in my arms. I have seen cities burn. I chose to end it. I chose to bear the burden of that decision so that no one else would ever have to suffer again. And in doing so, you have built the most beautiful, perfect, and inescapable prison in the multiverse. The fulcrum countered, its voice rising with a cold, terrible power. You despise All for One, but you have become his mirror. He hoards quirks to gain power. You suppress them to maintain it. Both of you deny others their potential for your own grand design. The opposite of tyranny is not benevolent order. It is freedom. And freedom is inherently messy. It is chaotic. It is dangerous. The fulcrum took a step closer, its dual-colored eyes boring into the hero's soul. A world without shadow has no light, only glare. The words hung in the air, a perfect and damning summation of all he had built. All Might, for the first time in 50 years, had no answer. He was the sun, and he had burned away the very world he had meant to illuminate, leaving only a bleached-out desert. I will not fight you, Toshinori Yagi, the fulcrum said, its voice softening again. The boy I was still respects the man you are. But I will not allow this reality to die. I am going to give your perfect world a gift. A flaw. With that, the fulcrum dissolved into motes of red and green light, leaving All Might alone in his silent, white tower, the echo of its final word hanging in the air like a crack forming in a sheet of glass. In the rebel base, Achiko and her team were watching the fulcrum on their holographic projector. It had linked its consciousness to their system, allowing them to witness the entire exchange with All Might. They were speechless, watching someone finally articulate the deep wrongness they had felt their entire lives, and to do it to the face of God himself. He gets it. The Bakugo of this world whispered, his hands trembling. He had always felt a rage inside him, a desire to explode, and had always believed it was a sickness. For the first time, he considered it might just be him. The fulcrum coalesced back in the center of the room. It looked at Achiko, its expression unreadable. A philosophical victory is meaningless without action, it stated. But a war would be equally wrong. You cannot bomb a world into freedom. You must teach it to want to be free. You must show them that the cage, however comfortable, is still a cage. How? Achiko asked, her heart pounding. They're content. They don't want to be free. They're afraid of it. Then you must show them what has been taken from them, the fulcrum replied. With a flicker of its will, it bypassed decades of HPSC encryption, sliding through their firewalls like a ghost through a wall. It dove deep into their most protected server, a place known only to the highest echelons of the Commission and All Might himself, the Vault. It was not a physical place. It was a digital archive, a cold storage of potential. It was a list. A list of every single disruptive quirk identified in the last 30 years. But it was more than that. It didn't just list the quirk and the patient. It detailed the potential of each quirk, its possible evolutions, its creative and destructive applications, all catalogued with cold, scientific precision. And next to that was the most damning file of all. Project Pantheon. A top-secret program to not just suppress the most powerful quirks, but to preserve their genetic code. To collect them. To hoard them. The reasoning was chillingly logical. In the event of an unforeseen, extra-dimensional threat, these assets may need to be reactivated and deployed under the control of the symbol of peace. They weren't just preventing threats. They were building an arsenal. They had become hoarders of power, just like All for One. The fulcrum didn't leak the entire database. It didn't expose the individuals. It extracted one piece of irrefutable data, the title page of Project Pantheon, the mission statement signed by the HPSC president and countersigned by All Might, and the raw number of assets collected. 2,417. It handed the data packet to Achiko. Do not call them to war, the fulcrum instructed. Do not ask them to riot. Simply show them this, and ask them a question. Is the shepherd who secretly shears his flock for his own future use still a protector? Or has he become a farmer? Achiko looked at the data, her eyes wide with a terrible, righteous fury. She finally understood. This was the crack in the glass. That night, for the first time in decades,
the emergency broadcast system was activated. But it wasn't a warning from the HPSC. On every screen, on every holographic advertisement, a single image appeared, the title page of Project Pantheon. Below it, a simple text scrolled, written in Achiko's own impassioned words. They told us our power was a sickness. They told us it was for our own safety. They told us it was to protect society. But they have been lying. They are not protecting us from our quirks. They are taking them from us. They see our potential not as a gift to be nurtured, but as a resource to be collected. We are not their citizens. We are their crop. We have been living in a beautiful cage, and all this time, our jailer has been secretly saving our clipped wings for himself. Look at your children. Look at yourselves, and ask, what could you have been, if you had been allowed to fly? The effect was not a riot. It was a deep, profound, and terrifying silence. A collective cognitive dissonance that swept across the planet. A man whose son had been cured of a pyrokinesis quirk suddenly wondered if his son could have been a hero-like endeavor. A woman who had suppressed her own minor teleportation quirk her whole life suddenly wondered if she could have been an explorer. The placid contentment was shattered, replaced by a single, poisonous question: what if? The next day, the first protests began. It was not loud or violent. 100 people gathered in the pristine plaza before the Aegis Tower. They didn't shout. They didn't carry signs. They just stood there, holding small, pocket-sized mirrors, angling them up to reflect the sun's glare onto the face of the tower. It was a silent, beautiful, and profoundly chaotic act. The fulcrum watched from an unseen vantage point, its work here done. It had not destroyed the order. It had simply introduced a single, undeniable seed of chaos. It had given the people back their right to question, to be angry, to be dissatisfied. It had given them back their right to be gloriously, beautifully, and dangerously imperfect. It had learned its second lesson. Balance was not a fixed point between two armies. It was the delicate, ever-shifting tension between the prison of absolute safety and the abyss of absolute freedom. Both were necessary. Both were dangerous. And the health of a universe was measured by its ability to dance between the two. A rift of swirling red and green opened in the air. The fulcrum took one last look at the silent protesters and their mirrored light, a new form of art in a world that was slowly, painfully, learning to feel again. Then, it stepped through, leaving the world of glass to its uncertain, but now beautifully flawed, future. The space between worlds was not a space at all. It was not the silent, cold vacuum of the cosmos, nor was it the violent, screaming chaos of a wormhole. It was a place of pure potential, a conceptual ocean that Izuku Midoriya's new consciousness had designated the nexus. To perceive it with human eyes would be to invite madness, but the fulcrum did not have human eyes. It perceived this place as it truly was, an infinite dark stillness, populated not by stars, but by universes. Each point of light in the endless expanse was a reality. Some burned with the steady, brilliant white blue of stable, mature existences. Others were angry, chaotic swirls of red and orange, realities embroiled in cosmic wars or existential crises. He saw nascent universes, faint as nebulae, just beginning to form their own physical laws. He saw ancient ones, dimming into the deep violet of entropic heat death. He could feel the state of each one as a distinct chord of music, some harmonious, some dissonant, some screaming, some fading into a final, silent note. His own form here was equally abstract. He was not the boy of flesh and bone. He was a locus of consciousness, a standing wave in the cosmic ocean. To a theoretical observer, he might have appeared as a humanoid silhouette woven from two impossible, warring energies. One was the vibrant, life-giving emerald of One for All, a light that sought to connect, to flow outwards, to share itself with the sea of realities. The other was the deep, gravitational crimson of All for One, a light that sought to pull inward, to contain, to understand by possessing. The two forces did not fight. They danced, swirling around and through each other in a perfect, dynamic equilibrium, creating a form that was both and neither. This was his true self now, a living paradox, a sentient fulcrum. This was his home. A throne room at the center of everything and nothing. He had returned here after his judgment in the world of glass, the memory of its sterile beauty and nascent rebellion a fresh chord in his own symphony of being. He had acted on instinct in both worlds he'd visited, guided by the foundational drive of Izuku Midoriya to save and the cold logic of All for One to correct. He had calibrated the scales, but the why of it all remained an intellectual puzzle, a question that the vast, new processing power of his mind demanded an answer to. What am I? The question was not born of angst, but of a need for definition, for purpose, and in the silent nexus, the voices within him finally answered. They did not speak with mouths, but as distinct currents within his own consciousness. They were the vestiges, but they were no longer the frantic, warring ghosts of his past. They were integrated, fundamental aspects of his new self, a council of concepts that formed his inner world. The first to coalesce was a current of warm, fierce light, smelling of sea salt and ozone. It was the essence of compassion, of sacrifice. Nana Shimura, you are the ultimate expression of what we fought for, Izuku. Her voice was no longer a memory, but a living thought stream, filled with a deep, maternal pride. One for All was always about more than just fighting villains. It was about preserving the future. Preserving hope. You saved those worlds not by destroying their monsters, but by giving them back their hope. You are a hero to realities themselves, a second current, colder, sharper, and resonating with the ancient hum of absolute power, countered her. It was the essence of ambition, of order, of consumption as a form of understanding, all for one. Sentimental nonsense. The thought was not malicious. It was a statement of fact, as cold and clear as a diamond. Hope is an emotional byproduct, not a strategic objective. You are not a hero, you are a regulator. A function. Your purpose is to correct imbalances that threaten the integrity of the system. The world of Ash was inefficient, stagnant under a bored tyrant. You introduced chaos to stimulate growth. A necessary, if messy, solution. The world of Glass was a system so stable it was approaching stasis. You introduced dissent to prevent its heat death. You are not a savior. You are a cosmic mechanic. Before Nana's warmth could curdle into indignation, a third current bridged the gap between them. It was a thin, resilient thread of light, humming with defiance and a profound, weary wisdom. It was the beginning of the story, the original spark. Yoichi Shigaraki. You are both right. He projected, his thought stream calm and mediating. And therefore you are both wrong. You are looking at the fulcrum through the lens of your own origins. He addressed the all-for-one consciousness directly. Brother, you see only systems and efficiency. You see his actions in the world of Ash as stimulating growth. You fail to grasp the conceptual importance of what he truly restored, the right to struggle. You would have had him erase the tyrant, and install a more efficient one, trading one cage for another. He gave them back their freedom, and the terrible, beautiful price that comes with it. Then Yoichi's essence turned to Nana. And Nana, you see only the preservation of hope. In the world of Glass, you lament the loss of feeling. But you risk devaluing the other side of the scale. The all-for-one aspect of the fulcrum understands the value of order. That world's All Might, in his misguided way, created a society free from the visceral suffering you knew. He eliminated true evil. The fulcrum solution was not to plunge that world into a destructive war, but to introduce a conceptual flaw, a question. It was a surgical strike, not a sentimental crusade. The consciousness that was Izuku absorbed this dialogue. It was a Socratic debate played out on a metaphysical stage. The core principles of the two great, warring quirks, moderated by their shared origin. So I am not here to ensure the victory of good over evil. The fulcrum projected, the thought a question to its counsel. Nana Shimura. Good and evil are what mortals call the struggle. We see it more clearly now. It is creation versus consumption. The drive to build, to connect, to sacrifice for others, to create something new out of nothing, all for one. And the drive to take, to control, to perfect, to impose a logical order on a chaotic universe. Creation without consumption is a cancerous, uncontrolled growth. Consumption without creation is a snake eating its own tail. They are symbiotic, not adversarial. They require each other to have meaning. The fulcrum turned its vast attention to the memory of the world of Ash. It re-examined its actions. It had dismantled the tyrant's power base, but it had left him strong enough to remain a credible threat. It had empowered the rebellion, but it had shown its leader the tyrant he could become. It had not handed victory to the heroes, it had restored the conflict, but elevated it, forcing both sides to reconsider the nature of their struggle. Then, it turned to the world of glass. It had not armed the rebels. It had not attacked All Might. It had exposed the single, fundamental truth that undermined the philosophical foundation of the utopia. It had given the people a reason to desire freedom, but left the architecture of their safe society intact. It had forced a conversation, not a war. It was balance. Not a static point in the middle, but the deliberate act of adding and subtracting weight to keep the grand mechanism of reality in perpetual, dynamic motion. Yoichi Shigaraki. You see it now. Your purpose is not to choose a side. Your purpose is to ensure that both sides always exist. You are the eternal arbiter, the judge who ensures the trial never ends, because the trial is the point. That is your function. That is your name. And as the three primary vestiges spoke the word in unison, it resonated through the nexus, through every fiber of his being, a conceptual coronation. The fulcrum. The title settled upon him, not as a weight, but as a definition. It was the answer to his question. It was the name of his office. He was no longer Izuku Midoriya, ninth holder. He was the fulcrum of the multiverse. But as this new, profound understanding settled, the cold, analytical consciousness of All for One detected something else. A flicker of wrongness at the edge of perception. All for One. There is another variable. One that does not fit the equation. Nana Shimura. What do you mean? What else is there besides the struggle? All for One. The struggle is a form of existence. It is a dialogue between something and something else. This is different. It is the antithesis of dialogue. It is the sound of silence. A cosmic static. The fulcrum focused its immense senses, pushing past the music of the spheres, past the familiar push and pull of creation and consumption. And it felt it. A cold spot in the warmth of existence. An invasive, profound nothingness that was actively hostile to the somethingness of reality. It wasn't a force of tyranny or chaos. It wasn't trying to rule or liberate. It was erasing. It was an ontological void, a form of cosmic entropy that didn't just seek to break things down, but to unwrite their very existence, to reduce their story to a blank page. Yoichi Shigaraki. Where is it coming from? His thought stream was laced with a new, ancient fear. All for One. It is not coming from anywhere. It is. It is the universe's final state, the absolute zero of existence, made manifest and impatient. And it is drawn to noise. It is drawn to realities with strong narratives. Realities with complex struggles. The fulcrum extended its perception, guided by the cold dread of its inner counsel. It found a distant point of light in the nexus, a small, unremarkable universe, and it watched, with a detachment that terrified the human part of itself, as the static found it. The star of that reality did not explode in a supernova of war. It did not dim and fade with the slow heat death of ages. It simply stopped. One moment, the chord of its existence was playing its unique, quiet song in the cosmic symphony. The next, there was only silence. The light went out. The story was over. It hadn't ended. It had been unhappened. A wave of conceptual horror washed through the fulcrum. This was not a weight on a scale to be balanced. This was a force that wanted to destroy the scale itself. Nana Shimura. Why now? Why are we only sensing it now? It was the all-for-one aspect that answered, its logic cold and inescapable. The answer was a terror all its own, all for one. Because we created a beacon. The paradox of our fusion, the creation of a single being embodying the ultimate principles of creation and consumption. It is the loudest event in the history of the multiverse. We have become a lighthouse in the endless dark, and we have attracted the attention of the thing that hates the light. The truth settled. His very creation, the solution to the conflict of his own world, had made him the primary target for a force that could unmake all worlds. His new purpose was not just to balance the struggle, but to protect the struggle's very right to exist from an enemy that sought to silence it forever. A new, heavier weight settled onto his soul. The weight of all stories ever told. And in that moment of crushing, cosmic responsibility, a smaller, sharper, and infinitely more painful feeling pierced through the grandeur. It was the echo of Izuku Midoriya, a ghost of a boy, shivering in the heart of a god. It was the feeling of being utterly and completely alone. He needed an anchor. A reminder of the world that had birthed him, the struggle that had defined him. With a deliberate act of will, the fulcrum focused its perception, tuning the infinite sensory apparatus of its being away from the grand sweep of the multiverse and onto a single, brilliant, and beloved point of light, his home. Earth. Reality designation, Primo FA9. The perspective zoomed, not through space, but through dimensions, until his consciousness hovered unseen over the world he had left behind. Time had passed differently. A few weeks had gone by. His perception settled first on the newly rebuilt Gamma Gym at UA High. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and nitroglycerin. Katsuki Bakugo was there, alone. He was not screaming. He was not yelling. The silence was more terrifying than any of his rages. He was training. But it was different. He wasn't just trying to increase his power output. He was performing feats of impossible control. He created a sustained, stable ball of explosive energy in his palm, holding it steady as a miniature sun. He used tiny, precise explosions at his feet to hover in the air, not with the wild abandon of his usual flight, but with the quiet precision of a hummingbird. The fulcrum could feel his thoughts, not as words, but as a burning, focused intent. Bakugo wasn't trying to catch up to Deku anymore. He had seen something on that battlefield, a scale of power that his mind was still struggling to process. He was no longer trying to be the number one hero. He was trying to comprehend the rules of a whole new game. He was trying to master the concept of the explosion itself, to understand its place in creation, as if by understanding the smallest piece of chaos, he could someday comprehend the whole. His rival had not just beaten him, he had transcended the entire arena, and Bakugo was now silently, furiously, trying to build a ladder to the stars just to be able to see the new battlefield. It was a humbling, focused rage that was more potent than any of his previous tantrums. The fulcrum's perspective shifted. A park bench, under a sky turning dusky pink. Achiko Uraraka sat there, a textbook on disaster relief legislation forgotten in her lap. She wasn't reading. She was looking up, her gaze fixed on the first stars beginning to appear. There was a quiet, unshakable determination in her eyes. The world had been saved, but she looked like a soldier on a lonely watch. The fulcrum could feel her heart, a steady pulse of longing and hope. She was not just stargazing. She was looking for him. She was holding a silent vigil, refusing to believe that the boy who had told her his name under a sky full of stars was gone forever. It was an act of faith so pure and simple it felt like a physical anchor in the fulcrum's vast, placeless existence. Finally, the perspective moved to a quiet, darkened office. A small apartment, smelling of old tea and liniment. Tashinori Yagi, All Might, sat in his armchair, the moonlight from the window illuminating his skeletal form. He was not watching television. He was not reading. He was staring at his own hand. In his palm rested the object the fulcrum had left him, the flickering, ghost-light ember of One for All's memory. It pulsed with a soft, green light, a firefly in the ruins of a legend. He was not just looking at it. He was communing with it. The fulcrum could feel his emotions, a complex and agonizing chord of immense pride and bottomless grief. He was a father who had watched his son achieve the impossible, a feat that saved the world, but in doing so, the son had become something so far beyond him that he was lost forever. He was grappling with the knowledge that his entire life's philosophy, the black and white world of good versus evil, was a child's story compared to the reality his successor now inhabited. The ember was his proof that it had all been real, and his penance. His pride in Izuku was a sun. His grief at losing him was a black hole. He was trapped in the orbit between them. The fulcrum watched them all, the rival striving for a new level of understanding, the friend holding on to a steadfast hope, the father mourning a living son, and the vast, cosmic consciousness of the fulcrum shuddered. The serene, analytical mind that could process the life and death of universes was overwhelmed by a simple, human agony, loneliness. It was a pain sharper than any physical wound Izuku Midoriya had ever endured. It was the absolute certainty that he could see them, feel them, understand the innermost workings of their souls, but he could never again sit with them, speak with them, share a meal with them. He was the ultimate observer, the eternal outsider. He was the guardian of the story, but he could no longer be a character in it. He was a god with a ghost of a boy weeping in its heart. And in the infinite, silent expanse of the Nexus, surrounded by a billion souls, he had never felt more alone. The weight of his purpose was immense, but it was the weight of his own lost humanity that threatened to crush him. His work was not over. It had just begun. But for the first time, as the last remnants of the boy named Izuku Midoriya ached for a home he could never return to, the fulcrum wondered if it was a price he could bear to pay.